as we go through our 5 programs together, we thought, and we will do this on every occasion, to bring out the collection. So if you're interested, anything like this, would like to kind of, sort of do your own thinking about it, come to your own conclusions about it, at the front of the room, and certainly during break and after the session, if you want to come up and take a closer look, please do. And a few of us sort of guide you through the process of looking at them. On 5 tables based on the races that Morton used, and you can use your own eyes basically to see probably one of the most key features or facets of a collection like the Morton collection, that there's a huge amount of variation within each one of these categories. And there wasn't an emphasis in Morton's time on the variation. There was an emphasis on really classifying those beings in these nice little pots, these nice little categories. The Morton collection has been very instrumental, basically, in doing something which we'll explore in our workshops together, and that is actually sort of science-izing race. And that's really sort of the direction and the idea that cost you, especially this evening, when we discuss the history of the race concept, especially as it intersects with all of these biological features that people have come to use and misuse in the classification of peoples. So Samuel Morton, a Philadelphia physician, I have to tell you that the collection came to the museum actually in the 1960s. The collection was made while Samuel Morton was actually the director of the Academy of Natural Sciences. At that time, the collection was made not only just of the crania, but also 2 of animal skulls. We have the collection in the museum, and we behave and use the collection in a variety of ways. We have, of course, the accumulation of the history of the collection. We do collection management. We make sure that everything is structured and well organized. We preserve the collection, basically meaning that we keep it under appropriate conditions, make sure everything is in good stead, make sure handling occurs properly. We interpret the collection for scientific research. In case some of you are interested in this, the collection has been at the center of research of many hundreds of students and researchers around the globe, and it continues to be so. And you can see the spinning skull actually on the side. That actually is a CT scan, a reconstructed CT scan rendering to show you something else which is key about the collection and what we've done here at the Penn Museum. And that is that we distribute actually CT scans of our collection, not just the Morton collection, but other parts of the collection, to researchers around the world. So literally we have hundreds of virtual visitors to the collection for scientific purposes. And then the last is, and this has been a goal, a very strong one for all of us at the Penn Museum, interpreting that collection for the public. We use this in classrooms. We actually use it in a variety of tours, which we give in the museum. We have an exhibit, actually, in which the Morton collection is very much sort of centralized. In any event, we hope that during the course of our time together, this will be the only time when a head is actually talking at you. You'll be able to come forward and actually really handle them if you would like, actually, but also to just look at them, get the gestalt of them. That might be the best way to think of it. So Samuel Morton is a 19th century physician. He obviously is interested in natural history. I won't labor a lot of the details essentially about him, but he collected these skulls between about 1830 and his untimely death in 1852. His collection was carried on after his death by really his student, a man by the name of Meigs. And Meigs increased the collection up to about 1,500 crania, so it's a massive collection. The collection comes from, obviously, all populations around the globe. He did no travels. He did not collect the skulls himself. He had fellow physicians in these varied places around the world actually do the collecting for him. He was very concerned in making sure that he had a sample, basically, of all peoples. And in some cases, we actually have the names of those people. So we just know historic details about the persons, okay, that are actually present in the collection. He also collected animals. He was very interested in the whole process of classification and looking at, the continuity and discontinuity between different forms. Very interestingly, the collections that he made that were not human remained at the Academy, and some of them have actually kind of lost their position, and people don't know where that part of the collection actually is. But he consecutively numbered the humans with the animal crania that were part of the collection, and only the humans moved here. As Paul had said, Morton was a prolific person. He was a real true scientist in his time. He made many publications, actually, in using the collection. He, we say science-ized this sort of idea of population and race by actually not just, identifying different crania based on characteristics, but taking these precise measures. He also used very simple descriptive statistics to talk about them as well, which is also a key component to this. As Paul had mentioned, his primary focus was actually looking at brain size, which he got to by looking at cranial capacity, a proxy basically for brain size. The crania themselves are magnificent. For those of you who don't know it, the Penn Museum has somewhere between about 12 and 15,000 skeletal people. Sometimes, we are almost, overcome by the grandness, essentially, of the collections that we have here. As I had said, we host many hundreds of researchers to the collections and working in a variety of different kinds of ways and capacities, including many historians of science. The collections are really world-renowned. The Morton collection, separately from this, is also world-renowned. The collection is actually, you'll see when you come forward, and hopefully you're going to do this. I'm feeling a little bit formal standing here at a microphone, but we really want you to move around if you can. You'll see that the individual skulls are actually written on, that the collector is sometimes written on them, the population affinities of the person are actually written, and in many cases, the actual measurements are written on the skulls. So if you wonder what a cranial capacity of 1,200 milliliters looks like, you'll be able to see it actually written on on the specimens. They're done in cubic inches, so you have to make that translation for yourself to milliliters, because mostly when we talk about brain size in the modern world, we talk about it in millimeters, not cubic inches. But obviously, you can see that there are differences in brain size between the different crania which are represented. He was, I must emphasize, a meticulous scientist. So it's one of these sort of classic examples where the science is there. I mean, he obviously is accurately taking these measures. He's accurately representing the means of these measures. It's just that everything that's layered into the scientific process is actually astray or askew. His samples are skewed. His way of actually dealing with those measurements actually are skewed. He actually is presenting this on a particular topic, which is really not at a point where he can understand the nature of variation. So it's not like it is a sort of perfect form of science. The methods are very well done. The ways that he actually challenged himself to be accurate in those measurements are actually very well done. As Paul had said, he was very interested in all of the scientific methods which were present at the time, including phrenology, this idea that you could look at bumps on the skull. He was such a scientist that he felt as if he himself could not actually accurately represent the bumps. So he winds up actually doing something a little peculiar for him, is that he takes the expert in phrenology and has him present the phrenological parts of the collection as a separate authored component of his writings, of his work. So he stands down essentially from the things that he thinks he actually cannot accumulate. The phrenological specimens in the collection are super interesting, and I always say some of the actual points which are felt and really kind of, measured in terms of their, depth or extent or their feel or their topography or whatever, look like they're in very painful places. So I can't even imagine, because they did this on living people too, taking your finger and digging it into the top of your eye orbit to see whether or not you're an especially circumspect person by having an especially lovely bump in the middle of your eye orbit. So he is, the man of his time, accumulating the maximum amount of data. He not only did cranial capacity, but he did this thing called face angle, because he has this idea that the more projecting the face is, the more primitive or ape-like actually the individual populations actually are. So you'll actually see the facial angle written on many of the crania as well. And so, although the bulk of his work was really dedicated to looking at cranial capacity, he does take other kinds of measurements too. In order to actually show that his measurements were accurate, you can, of course, now recognize Paul. And one of our other wonderful students here at Penn, Samantha Cox, who can't be with us actually this evening, she and Paul took on the process of actually trying to figure out how to measure crania. And what they were able to do is actually very nicely show that Morton, with all of the sort of fallacies that were really layered into his work, he was actually accurately measuring the crania. And we did this time and time again, and did this in a meticulous fashion in order to reproduce his methodologies. Measurements are a big part, basically, of physical anthropology. Not only, as Paul was showing with Brandon's Boaz, but since that point in time. So this meticulous accumulation of data has been with us in the field. And many volumes, essentially, are actually reproduced on measurement data, not just of this collection, but of many collections. There are many discussions as to the motivation of Morton in doing this. His work was used very heavily and heavily relied upon, actually, to support the anti-abolition movement. If you read this quote, if you have the Mormon scholars who are sitting up there, you'll see that he cares not the origin, essentially, of this inferiority that comes, from nature and nurture. It just is that in the end, there is, really a way to rank peoples, basically from superior to inferior. This component of his work is probably the most treacherous in the sense that it is used so often, essentially from this point onward, to talk about these differences between the human races. It's a little bit of a surprise to me to hear knocking on the door, excuse me. And it's somebody that's not going to take no for an answer, clearly. And I think we just have to answer it. Actually, I think it's one of those. The actual cemetery. Morton actually died after a 3-day illness, quite dramatically and quite quickly. His grave is actually at Laurel Hill Cemetery here in Philadelphia. If you have a chance to go to Laurel Hill, which is an open place for you to explore, biking, taking your kids for a walk, taking your dog for a walk. The grave marker is very instructive as well. You can see on the back of it, again, if you can read it, it says President of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia, author of Crania Americana. And it also says, wherever truth is loved or science honored, his name will be revered. He does not die whose fame endured is the translation of the Latin. So he is maybe not famous, but he certainly is infamous. So with that, okay, I'll actually kind of end my component as the introduction, essentially, to the collection. In each session, we will bring out a visual associated with the Morton collection so you can see basically the sorts of things that he was doing and the ways this has informed basically this kind of idea of race biology. And you can do readings actually on our website, which actually kind of give you a sort of a fuller view, basically, of all of the topics that we'll cover in our sessions together. So I would hope, okay, that you will enjoy our moderated sessions, which will begin promptly. Hopefully the person will stop knocking at the door and everything will go along well. I don't think I've ever had that happen while I was talking. So it's, and I give many lectures, so of course it's a big surprise to me. And you'll be able to actually obviously come forward and look at the crania, but also to engage in a conversation with us on the various topics which will be presented this evening. So many thank you for everyone for actually coming in this very warm and beautiful September evening. So I think we want to do our moderated panels, actually. Or do we take a break? Actually, I think we might take a bit of a break. Yes. Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. It's another Q&A. Anybody with questions, you want to come forward? There's a microphone at the front of the room. Please ask me a question. Or just come forward to look at the crania. Please go ahead on over to the mic. Don't be shy.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Thank you so much. And you handled the whole door knocking thing beautifully, so kudos to you. My question is, at some point, or during some point in time, what Morton, his scientific methods and his thoughts from that he pulled from that, specifically about the inferiority of certain races, was considered science and usable. And at what point in time, years, what year did we come to the realization that that aspect of his findings were wrong?
I can identify a 0.0 basically, but many things accumulated that showed, for example, that brain size is not associated with intelligence. I mean, that would be a core concept, which is a necessary part to really understanding that, you know, doing this particular type of work is not going to, you know, basically come to a conclusion of mental inferiority or superiority. So I would say
so there were no, like, you know, during the 1950s, during the 1930s, 1920s, that we all had an epiphany that perhaps it was wrong?
An epiphany, it's a good question. Probably we can ask some of our historians that'll actually come up to the panel too, to know if there's kind of a 0.0 in that kind of discussion. I would say that most of the features that are associated with his sort of typology really fall by the wayside as people begin to understand variation through the 20th century. Is there a, you know, sort of a point? I can't actually, you know, sort of narrow in and hit a particular place, but certainly, you know, people began to question the efficacy of doing any kind of classification like this, beginning really basically in the early part of the 20th century. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
How representative is this collection of all the breadth of human diversity, and is it skewed in some ways? I imagine it's probably more heavily European, but you know, can you talk a little bit about that? And how do you decide if it's well represented?
It's also a great question. I mean, how would you represent human diversity in any collection, actually? I mean, you know, when we even confront that today, I would say, in the various studies which are performed in looking at genetics of human variation. Who do we sample? How broadly do we sample? How far afield do we go in sampling? All of those things are going to be critical issues in any assessment of human variation. The collection is indeed biased, and it was biased based on the kinds of skulls that he could actually accumulate at that time. He spends a lot of time looking to and trading with other people who are collecting skulls to make sure that he fills in or fills out his collection. Probably the best series that are part of the collection are the ones that he really did concentrate on, one from Egypt, a broad one from Egypt, and a broad one from the Americas. And he, basically made sure that he sampled those probably as thoroughly as he possibly could. The collections that come from Asia and from the Pacific are weaker. I mean, I would actually say certainly not as broadly representative as the ones from Egypt and the Americas. And there's, for him, it was just having crania from those race groups, because remember, he was typing them and they're representing that particular space and place, that it didn't matter, basically, if he was, sampling some variety of European or some, other island within the Pacific. It was just that he had a representative, essentially, of that group of people. Because remember, they're super typologically thinking at that point in time. But again, I have to say, I think we're always challenged, basically, in trying to see how our sampling strategy is influencing the conclusions that we come to, even in modern science. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Are there any modern, generalization of categories? Because he has 5 very broad ones here. Are there any modern day equivalents of that? And is there any remnant of his work in modern day chronology?
In modern day?
Chronology.
Modern chronology.
Or?
So, I mean, are you thinking, in some kind of time sequence, or?
Or in, I guess, people who study skulls today, do they follow certain guidelines that are broad categorizations of that?
It's also a really interesting question. I don't think that, and we sort of, try to land in a way to think about this, that people study crania in this particular way today. We do have people who, try to model the human skull in various ways and look at variations in the human skull, but they don't actually sort of box that into these categories called races. So I would say that there's no equivalent, basically, in the modern world of, this kind of a process. We do, in the field that I work in, biological anthropology, measure and study human variation in a variety of ways, but it's usually directed at very particular questions, not whether or not, a whole race can be characterized in some particular way, especially to the exclusion or as a difference to another race. So, no.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have to apologize for coming in late. You may have answered the questions I'm about to ask. So if that has happened, I'm sorry. My questions are these. This gentleman was the president of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia. Who funded the Academy of Natural Sciences?
Who funded it?
Yeah, who funded it, and who funded the study that arrived at the conclusions that they came to?
It's I should mention, and no, we didn't. You were late, but you didn't miss a point here.
All right.
The collection was made as a private collection of Samuel Morton's. So although he was the president of the Academy, the collection was not something that they actually supported or were directing their efforts to. After his death, the collection was sold to the Academy. So who actually gave the funding for that? I'm not sure. Maybe, again, we do have some history of science people that are going to be panelists, and they might actually know the answer to that. But I don't know that that particular point is actually recorded in history. It might have just come from, the normal sort of funding streams which were present in museums at that time. I don't know that there was someone who particularly put money actually to purchase that collection.
Okay.
So I didn't make clear, however, and you're right to point out that this was his personal collection. It was like he, served in this capacity as the president, but his real functionality as a scientist was actually to study races.
What role, if any, was this used to justify slavery?
Very strongly so, actually. So, I mean, I think as you can imagine, he's going to rank the races based on brain size and then make the case that the skulls that he actually had that came from Africa were smaller brained. And then he was going to basically say that these were, people, he was, remember, you came in a little late, I'm sorry, he was probably a polygenist, that he thought each of the races were actually made independently by God, and that, basically this inferior race should serve the capacity, essentially, of serving others. So it was very directed towards that particular kind of end product. And because he was such a good scientist, it was a very effective tool in actually making that particular case.
So would it be fair to say that the whole study came about as part of the process of justifying slavery? And is that a reasonable assumption to come to? Or conclusion?
It's also a really good question. I'm not sure I'm not sure that we know Morton's motive. Was it just, to understand variation? Was it just really to, rank races? What was he really sort of driving at? He, in his writings, is not clear, actually, as to his sort of ultimate motivation. And indeed, he doesn't enter directly into the arguments that are associated with polygenesis or slavery. It's used by many in that particular mode. So he obviously knows that it's going to be used in that way, and many people have sought or tried to understand why, if he didn't have those kinds of motivations, essentially what were his motivations.
Okay. Well, never mind.
So I didn't really answer your question, but I don't think we know.
I will not make an editorial comment.
Oh, okay. You could make an editorial comment if you would like.
Well, based on my knowledge of history, it seems to me that it was a conclusion that they already had, and they were looking for a way to justify it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's real possible, yes. I would clap, too.
Hi. Since you have brought up that you're a biological anthropologist, I don't know if you or anyone else can answer this. I recently read that since we're talking about brain measurement, cranial capacity, that the average cranial capacity of humanity is actually decreasing?
It's going to sink into itself and form a black hole the rate we're going. I actually don't know that there is a scientific basis for saying that. I don't know that we've got that sort of super good of a handle on the variation which is present in cranial capacity or brain size. I do know that, these kinds of studies that just look at size, really, it has, no ability to reflect anything except that it's size. There have been obsessions with actually looking at size, as you can imagine, and many famous people actually donated their brains after death to science, and their size of their brain was actually measured. People like Einstein, obviously, you can see sections of his brain at the Mutter Museum at the College of Physicians. So they were looking at size, but also to gross morphology differences between brains of people. And there has never been an easy way, actually, to make a link between anything in that neurological set with any kinds of behaviors, including intelligence. Is it getting smaller? I have never seen anything, scientifically written on that score. It would seem to me as if, we're looking at probably a general average that's been maintained since almost the beginnings of humans. And it is on average, again, you get variations in the literature on this, probably something between about 1,200 to about 1,400 milliliters or so. And that also, in terms of sort of the facts of this whole thing, females have smaller brain sizes than do males. but I have to, of course, qualify that and smile as I say it. We always have to equalize brain size with body size, and if you equalize brain size for body size, females have a larger brain-body size ratio. So, I mean, and that's one, and that's one of the components of it. I want to carry on for just a minute more, however, because one of the fallacies in Morton was that he didn't understand that body size is a big component of brain size. So if he was sampling smaller people, they would just have smaller brain sizes, basically. So some of the differences that we see in the crania are actually explained on that score alone. And it is, probably one of the largest mistakes, that are inherent in this collection. I mean, beyond the sort of sampling strategy issues. So thank you. It's a great question. Hi.
Hi, good evening. So you mentioned at the beginning some of the ways that Morton obtained the skulls, that he bought them from other physicians. So I'm wondering how those physicians obtained the skulls. And you mentioned that some of the names were known and some weren't known. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering whether the people knew what was going to happen to their skull, whether mm-hmm. their families knew, mm-hmm. and whether there's a difference between those that are named and those that aren't named, and mm-hmm. those that are on the 5 different tables. Mm-hmm.
Oh, you have to stop asking me these good questions. I mean, I really feel that way. It's great questions. Some of them are actually archaeological, so they came from graves, basically. And any of a number of places, that had the graves of ancient peoples excavated, and they became part of the collection. Some of them actually came from people who were known that died under particular circumstances that allowed local physicians to actually collect them. So people who were executed, for example, people who died under unusual circumstances. Those people have a tendency in the collection to be the ones that we do know the names of the people and know a bit about their history. So if you look at the catalog, you'll see some of these named individuals with personal histories. A lot of them, you would say, fall into kind of a category really of, although we might not cast it this way today, criminal behaviors, who wouldn't have been given an option of what would happen to them after death. And then the crania come up in a variety of ways into the collection. And I seem like I might not be directly answering your question, but I'll tell you what we've been doing for the last 10 years. We've been attempting to research each one of these crania to make sure that we really understand their origins and how they wound up in the collection, who they were traded with, the time frame in which they were collected. And I would say at this point, each one of them really has a really individualized history. Some of the ones, like the samples that you can see on the far for you, the left-hand table, are people who are Africans. Tina wants me to shut up. Are Africans. And the bulk of that collection actually came from one cemetery actually in Cuba. So, we had a student who worked on this for a dissertation to actually ground and find the nature of that particular sampling. So it's varied, in other words. And some of them we don't know, and some of them we might not ever know. It depends on whether or not we've got the good correspondence to allow us to do it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And maybe I can take only one more question, and I apologize for that. Tina is definitely very good at making sure I stay on time, please.
I'll make it short and sweet. I'm hoping you're going to tell us that there was some robust debate among Morton's contemporaries as to his yes. Objectives and his methods and conclusions. And I'm wondering who might be some of those voices of opposition within and without the sciences.
Within the scientific community, I actually don't know of any. So, I mean, certainly there were robust discussions as to the nature of the process of classifying people in particular ways and using that discussion to classify and enslave people or keep them enslaved. But in terms of, the details of how this collection, was used in that capacity, it was not in the realm of basically active discussion. We do know that his material was used, like lifted, by people who really, to an extreme extent, wanted to support this anti-abolitionist movement. And they went around the United States giving lectures, basically, on how this collection actually supported their particular viewpoints. I don't think that, science at the time was robust enough, okay, that it generated a scientific discussion about the collection and about what Morton was doing. But again, I can stand corrected on this by some of our historians who will actually be on the panel. So you might want to come forward and ask the question again, okay? Thank you.